checking to see that I'm live and online. Hello, everyone, and please let me know if the sound is not good. Okay. Now, what have I done here? Okay. All right. And so we are live on YouTube, and today we're in hopefully the last session of 13 sessions on Answer to Job. We're going to be discussing paragraph 748 to 758. However, I have 9 pages of notes, so I'm not sure I'll get through it all. If I don't, we'll do it next week. And so just as a reminder here, hi, Miles. Thanks for letting me know. I appreciate it. To repeat from last week, the references are Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, and this is the 50th anniversary edition. It was originally published in 1952, and the other book that I'll be referring to later in the session is Transformation of the God Image by Edward Edinger, and that will take a little bit less of a role this time. And the foreword to that book is by Lawrence Jaffe. It's published by Inner City Books. Answer to Job is published by Princeton University Press. So the basic idea of Answer to Job, Job's encounter with Yahweh is followed by an activation of the collective unconscious by virtue of Job's profound conscious insight into the nature of the deity. Let's see here. And the God image feels obliged to move closer to humankind, come up out of the depths of the deep unconscious so some or all can see it. The God image is the most basic archetype, the deepest layer of the unconscious. It's also referred to as the self. It's the basic objective of the human psyche overall to fulfill this constellated archetype. And so just to remind you about where we were from last week, I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from paragraphs 746 and 747. The only thing that really matters now is whether man can climb up to a higher moral level, to a higher plane of consciousness, in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have played into his hands. Paragraph 747. Since the apocalypse, and by that Dr. Jung was referring to World War II, since the apocalypse, we now know again that God is not only to be loved, but also to be feared. He fills us with evil as well as with good. Otherwise, he would not need to be feared. And because he wants to become man, the uniting of his antinomy must take place in man. This involves man in a new responsibility. He can no longer wriggle out of it on the plea of his littleness or nothingness. Since he has been granted an almost godlike power, he can no longer remain blind and unconscious. He must know something of God's nature and of metaphysical processes. So now here, at this point, and this is the main thrust of this afternoon, enter the feminine principle. So remember now what Billy Joel said, we didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. And so the feminine principle has been coming through for a very long time, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So in paragraph 748, Dr. Jung is talking about the assumption of the Virgin Mary from the psychological background. And his point is that for about 1,000 years, Catholics were saying the Hail Mary prayer, and it became a very popular movement. And there were many visions of Mary, especially among children. And this, the popular movement and the psychological need behind it came forward. And Dr. Jung's point is that the collective unconscious is always at work, and there's a yearning among the masses for an intercessor and mediatrix. That's like, Mom, will you protect me from Daddy when he gets home? That's a mediatrix. Instead of taking the full-on brunt of Dad's ire if he's mad at you, you send Mom in to help you. And so that was sort of collective in the masses. And the Vatican finally caught on to this in 1950, and Pope Pius XII issued his papal bull. And Dr. Jung felt that this papal bull was extremely important. It's a new dogma, and skipping ahead to paragraph 754, the new dogma expresses a renewed hope for the fulfillment of that yearning for peace which stirs deep down in the soul, and for a resolution of the threatening tension between the opposites. And so, first of all, before we get to that even, we have to remember that Sophia, which is wisdom, was with God before the creation. That's in Proverbs. And there was always reference to the hieros gamos, which is the masculine and feminine undivided in the pleroma, which is pre-creation. It's in the psychic background. And mind you, we're always talking about psychology here. We're not talking about metaphysics. Okay, so anyway, but the significance of the hieros gamos is it signifies the birth of a savior, a peacemaker to come. And that's promised in Revelation, among other places. And so Dr. Jung says, although he was already born in the pleroma, his birth in time can only be accomplished when it is perceived, recognized, and declared by man. So what we're talking about here is the Catholic Church perceiving and recognizing that something has to be done about the Virgin Mary, and she needs to be admitted into heaven because that's what the archetype that is in the collective unconscious of everyone is demanding. Now, mind you, the feminine was coming forward, and let's see. Just want to make sure this is lined up for you. So the American manifestations started to show up in people like Susan B. Anthony. And Americans have a different psychology from the Catholic Church. We decide everything by confrontation and debate. So feminism and the role of women has been a big issue since around 1850. Elizabeth Cady Stanton issued her proclamation in 1848 at the convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And then Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton got really going on women's rights, women's suffrage in 1863, and they were also working on defeating slavery. And let me refer to some of these questions now. Hello, Clark. Welcome. Miles says, a Mohawk lady asked our group, I cannot understand that Christians have to fear their God. Jung reflect that fear is more that meaning respect, as some Christians like to assuage their acolytes. Apparently, acolyte is the wrong word. Oops, I mean students. Well, a Mohawk woman is a member of the Iroquois Nation, and there's a little story about the Iroquois Nation, because in 1848, this is in a book called The Discoverers by Daniel Borston. And Daniel Borston was the Librarian of Congress, and he was interested in how the Native American tribes came into the United States and where they might have come from before they came across the Bering Sea Bridge. And so he sent an organization chart of the Iroquois Nation to 200 consulates around the world and said, has anybody seen this organization chart? And only one responded, and that was the consulate in present-day Sri Lanka, in Ceylon. It was Ceylon at the time. And the consul general there identified the organization chart as the same as the Tamil tribe in India and Ceylon and Sri Lanka. And so, I'll point out that the city of Chennai, formerly called Madras, is in a state of India called Tamil Nadu, which means the place of the Tamils. And so the Tamil tribe was a distant ancestor to the Iroquois Nation. And the way Daniel Borston framed it, he said you couldn't tell by language because language changes too quickly. And of course, this move came at least maybe 13,000 years ago. And so nobody in the Iroquois Nation remembered that they had been originally Indians. So in a way, when Columbus called the Native Americans Indians, he was somewhat right, at least for some of them. And today we'd have to call them Sri Lankans. But anyway, that's just an interesting sidelight. And so obviously Native Americans have a little bit different perspective on religion compared to Americans, but I digress, so let's move on. Now getting into paragraph 749, we get into the meaning of this, and this is part of the continuing incarnation of God, which began with Christ. Okay, and so Christ was the first incarnation of God, and the Protestant reactions to the Assumption of Mary were alarming, according to Dr. Jung. Apparently, the bishops of the Episcopal Church in Britain got together and really denounced the papal bull in 1950. And he said, the Protestant standpoint has lost ground by not understanding the signs of the times and by ignoring the continued operation of the Holy Ghost. They're out of touch with our archetypal happenings. Well, of course they are, because they're still out of touch with the collective unconscious and psychology. And so fundamentalists especially are still trying to say that the Bible is physically true and absolutely true in the physical world. And what Dr. Jung is pointing out is that these events are psychic events. They're not physical events. And so the coming forth of the feminine principle was, as he said here, which I haven't read, was intended to compensate psychologically for the truly apocalyptic world situation today, which was, he was writing in 1951 when he wrote this book. And so, his comment about Protestantism was that it can therefore neither understand nor admit a further revelation of the divine drama, whereas the Catholic Church maintains a matrix which allows things to develop normally over the course of time. And okay, getting down to 750 now. Dr. Jung felt compelled to write based on his psychological experience. He claims that he was accused of psychologism, which represents a still primitive mode of magical thinking with the help of which one hopes to conjure the reality of the soul out of existence, after the manner of the practophantasmist. I'll leave it to you to work out the meaning of the first half of that word practo, but I think you can get the idea. The practophantasmist in Faust, who says, "Are you still here? Nay, it's a thing unheard. Vanish at once. We've said the enlightening word." Well, so anyway, they think that Dr. Jung will go away if he says an enlightening word. And I'm honored by a comment from a friend on Periscope who said that I seem to understand the Jewish and Muslim perspectives. I hope at this point that I somewhat do. I have republished a book by a rabbi friend of mine called Finding Ourselves in Biblical Narratives. Or it's called What's in It for Me? Finding Ourselves in Biblical Narratives. And he gives a modern discussion of what the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, mean. And aside from that, I've spent quite a bit of time in the Muslim world, and so I do know something about that. And I know that Muslims at this point in time, at the time of Job, were basically the same as the Jews, and Islam per se didn't really start to appear until 1,000 years later. So, and here we're talking about the evolution of the human psyche. So. So Miles says, Indians come from Italian on gent on Dio, a people of God. Clark says, so I have been thinking a lot about the psychologism issue and his statement on it, but I've settled on him as not wanting his psychology to attempt to answer the big philosophical questions. In a sense, he was ducking them. Okay, he was ducking some of them, as we'll see. But here, and I have somebody outside my window very helpfully trimming around the grass with one of those noisy machines. So I hope you can hear me and that sound isn't too painful. But here, his comment was really aimed at Protestant theologians who had basically dumped on him all his life, and he was kind of dumping back by saying, you can't make me go away just by saying that my work is a psychologism, because I'm actually talking about things that do involve God, and so you need to face up to it. And So there's a need for wholeness. And so yesterday I was talking with a friend, and he commented that some of my recent comments made it sound like I was one-sided, that I was all for the eros. And I want to correct that impression because what we need is wholeness. We don't need all eros, and we don't need all logos. And so I make this tongue-in-cheek comment here on this note: is Professor Jordan Peterson a practophantasmist with his emphasis on the logos? There needs to be balance. And so I can't be whatever the opposite of the practophantasmist is either, because I do believe in balance. We can't have all logos, and we cannot have all eros. And indeed, one of the things that Dr. Jung was commenting about was that there was a need for logos at the time of Christ and in the millennium before, and therefore the Jewish dispensation of God, which is the law, and so the logos had to be introduced into the human psyche so that there could be rationality. But the point is that rationality has now gone too far. It's discerning or slicing and dicing what the world thinks rather than uniting. And we see what I would call a terrible version of that in the United States right now, and the separation of our red state, blue state ideas is not healthy for the American nation. So anyway, paragraph 751, does Dr. Jung believe in God? And so this is, now we're getting into the real short strokes of these last few chapters, which I acknowledge are somewhat controversial. And so he says, what most people overlook or seem unable to understand is the fact that I regard the psyche as real. They believe only in physical facts. God is an obvious psychic and non-physical fact, i.e., a fact that can be established psychically, but not physically. And so this is an important distinction, and this is where my epiphany comes in. And so he's speaking about the assumption here, and he says, he considers the assumption to be the most important religious event since the Reformation, and it makes sense to the psychological mind. So he's evaluating Pius XII's bull from a psychological point of view. And this is where I had an aha moment. This was my epiphany. He says, it does not matter at all that a physically impossible fact is asserted, because all religious assertions are physical impossibilities. If they were not so, they would, as I said earlier, necessarily be treated in the textbooks of natural science. But religious statements, without exception, have to do with the reality of the psyche and not with the reality of the physis, the physical world. And so and also in paragraph 751, I didn't add it to these notes, but he's saying, otherwise you're saying that the laboratory equipment invented the atom bomb, and obviously it didn't. And in fact, everything, if you look around yourself right now, and some of you have heard me say this before, but if you look around yourself right now, with the exception of potted plants, and if you can look outside, plants, plants of all kinds, trees, etc. But with the exception of those, everything that you see that's man-made is a product of the psyche. It's because everything, including you and any human being that you can physically see right now, was once a gleam in your father's eye and your mother's eye. And so everything that we have first originated in the psyche. And if you get that point, then it's not too hard to get the fact that the psyche is real. And then you need to make this leap of faith, if you will, that everything that's religious is taking place here in the psyche. And this is the point that I've made many times, that every time you see a football player run across the goal line and point up, he's pointing in the wrong direction. He should be pointing at his heart, because God is in your heart, not in your head, and not in the universe per se. It's in the psychic universe. And this is one of my big criticisms of Neil deGrasse Tyson, who continually insists that everything has to be scientific. And I say, well, you've missed 7.5 billion universes, because everybody's got a psychic universe within their body, within their self somewhere, wherever that is. It probably is largely in the head, but we don't know where it is, honestly. So Clark said, So Clark says, well, the Protestants' big idea was not putting a person between man and God, yet many still felt fundamentalist answers were needed. They think that because of the power of the Logos, I think. Miles says, I think that since E equals MC squared is a trinity given by the Trinity, we best see that there is a fearsome side of the Creator. Well, surely there is. It sounds like you have a dragon there somewhere. Yes, the dragon is right outside. Hopefully he'll quiet down sometime soon. Clark says there are a lot of Neil deGrasse Tyson memes on the internet making fun of his materialism and limited creative thinking. Absolutely. I once heard him talking about Carl Sagan as if Carl Sagan were a god, and I guess to him, when he was a freshman at Cornell and Carl Sagan was the astronomy professor, he was like a god to him. But he talked about this magic numinous moment when he first arrived at Carl Sagan's office door and saw his name on the door and knew that he was going to go in and meet the great man at that moment. And what I said is that there's no way to describe that moment. I mean, we've all had moments like that with people that we've met, and you just can't adequately describe it. And it would take volumes to describe the psychic event that occurred at that moment. Well, at least they have a big lawnmower outside, but right at the crucial moment of Answer to Job, and we get this noise outside. But I mean, I remember a time that was something like that when my middle daughter was 5 years old. She was quite blonde. We were living in Japan, and I wanted to go to the camera shop in the Okura Hotel. And so it so happened that King Hussein of Jordan, the father of the current King Abdullah, was visiting Japan, and he was staying at the Okura. And so as my daughter and I were walking out of the camera shop, we went into this area where there were elevators, and the elevators were darkened. We didn't know what was going on, but they were darkened, and there were elevator operators who were women in beautiful kimonos in the elevators, but the elevators were darkened. And I didn't quite get it at that moment, but I turned around and I saw a Middle Eastern-looking man in a suit come around the corner, and I said, "Oh, I think something big is going to happen." I picked my daughter up and have her head up next to mine, her blonde head, and at that moment, King Hussein came around the corner, and he came up to her and said, "Oh, aren't you beautiful?" and shook her hand and shook my hand. And it was quite a meaningful moment to me. I mean, I can get choked up just thinking about it right now. And so, I know how Neil deGrasse Tyson must have felt at that moment in front of Carl Sagan's door, but you can't describe that in a book. You can have all the books on earth and probably not describe exactly what that feeling was and what the repercussions were. Sam says, "Of course it's all happening in your head. All right, but why should that mean it's not real?" Says Dumbledore at the end of Harry Potter in a glowing King's Cross station. I guess I didn't stick with Harry Potter long enough to see that. But anyway, it sounds like that J.K. Rowling was finally getting around to that. Anyway, so the controversial point that Dr. Jung makes, which maybe I can make now if the noise isn't too bad, is that Protestantism is left with the odium of being nothing but a man's religion, which allows no metaphysical representation of woman. And he says in that way it's similar to Mithraism, much to its detriment. The feminine, like the masculine, demands an equally personal representative. And so that is the big issue. And D. Lara, hi D. Lara, says, skip from Jung to Harry Potter. Well, I think I'm going to stick with Jung because I don't think I could get far enough along that I can understand Harry Potter. I'm still struggling with Jung. But it's nice to see you here, by the way. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so the point Dr. Jung makes in paragraph 754, one of the points there, I think 754 is the paragraph that goes on for 2.5 pages, but anyway, he says, Mary is not a goddess, but functionally on the par with Christ in the bridal chamber in heaven. And she's no longer down with Satan as before, at least not in the Catholic Church. So his point is that the dogma satisfies the need of the archetype from a religious point of view. There's one or two more passes here and we'll be done. Can you hear me? Not too good. Anyway, so what this means from the point of view of the archetype is that in Jungian psychology, when archetypes get activated, constellated, they have to play through. They have to go all the way through their cycle. And so his point is that moving Mary, the church accepting that Mary went into heaven, satisfies this need of the archetype, the idea of the feminine having an equal place with the masculine. And so then he says, how could Protestantism so completely miss the point? It has functionally it has to do with keeping job security for Protestant pastors, I suppose, also priests, but Protestant pastors who, this fellow Paul Vanderklay, who's done a lot of good videos about Jordan Peterson, still, every time Jordan Peterson gets off the Protestant script, Reverend Vanderklay wants to jam the last 2,000 years worth of doctrine and commentary down our throat, and that's all logos. And so he too is not balanced, and the problem is that Protestantism is not balanced on the feminine side. And Jung's point is that the Catholic Church is unperturbed by the intellectual difficulties and the objections of rationalists. The Pope just didn't care. And so he says this demonstrates the maternal character of the Catholic Church. And I just observed that the Tibetan Buddhist Lama that I have a meditation class with every week says that the term, or the part of the name Lama that's Ma, he says it means mother. So in effect, a Lama in Buddhism is a mother. Thinks of themselves on the feminine side. And so the point is that the Catholic Church is flowing in the yin-yang style with the spirit of the age, but the Protestant churches have not done this. And so let's see here. So Dr. Jung says from a psychological point of view that this Protestant spirit must be full of unrest and troublesome. It's even revolutionary in order to gain vitality. Nothing is achieved by giving negative criticism, however. It is justified only to the degree it is creative. And he talks about Protestantism and Catholicism being a disunited brother-sister pair, with the Catholic Church being the sister of the pair. And so it's a problem that we have in society generally, of course, where we've sliced and diced everything into opposites, and we need to find a way to start uniting, not only red state, blue state, not only Catholic, Protestant, but also everyone in the world. And that's the direction that Dr. Jung was pointing. But so he says there's a new responsibility toward the worldly spirit of the age, for he cannot simply deny his problematic sister before the eyes of the world. The Protestant must be fair to her if he does not want to lose his self-respect. Well, he was writing 60 years ago, more than, and so far the Protestant side hasn't seemed too worried about its self-respect, but so what is the meaning of the dogmatic assertions over and above their literal concretism? And so we get into Dr. Jung's hobby horse, which he mentions in many of his letters and so on, which is that he, the Protestant, should bend to the great task of reinterpreting all of the Christian traditions in the context of psychology, is what he's saying. And, that's a task that Edward Edinger took up and wrote 17 books on the topic, but it's been pretty much hushed up until now. So you're hearing it now, and I've been honored to have scores of people around the world now hearing these discussions that I've given. And So as we all hear it, we all need to start thinking about it. And Reach Outing on Periscope says, what about Orthodox? Don't they practice unity? I'm sorry to say I don't have a clue. I just don't have enough information about the Orthodox Church to respond to that. So anyway, Dr. Jung is emphasizing the solution must be possible. The assumption is a case where psychological understanding is needed because the mythologem coming to light is so obvious that it must be deliberately blinding ourselves if we cannot see its symbolic nature and interpret it in symbolic terms. So now I'll go back here. So Miles says, Pope Francis said that all the priests are superseded by Mary. I thought that was significant. Sounds significant. I hadn't heard that. And Clark says he loves Vanderklay. You know, I like Vanderklay too, because at least he's engaged with Jordan Peterson's work, and I think that that's significant. And there's very few others. There's a Catholic bishop that has done a bit of it, and he's also very good. And as we see, Vanderklay, Reverend Vanderklay admitted that at the beginning he only had memories, dreams, reflections, and he didn't know too much about Jung. I've gradually been trying to bring him along into understanding what Dr. Jung's work was really all about. And it's a slow process because he keeps going back to his divinity school pat answers to pretty much every question. And but I think he is gradually starting to get into the Jungian oeuvre. So I think that there is hope for him. Miles says, Vanderklay admitted that he has to be careful lest he be excommunicated. Well, that may be true. I think that this shows the fundamental law that Jung was not subject to. Absolutely, I agree with that. And some people criticize church as check your brain at the door. It could change to check your psyche at the door. Yeah, something like that. In any case, Clark says, I'd love it if we could get Vanderklay in some online meetings with us and talk about these things. We'd have to be careful what we talked about. Yeah, I'm working on technologically how to do that, and I certainly welcome your suggestions on that. The issue is that I don't have a lot of money to pay for a big online webinar where everybody can participate. I can use Google Hangouts, and that would put a conversation onto the YouTube channel. And that is possible, but that's limited to 10 people. And I'm currently cogitating on how I could do it. Obviously, with this group, there are a few of you that I would be very happy to engage in such a discussion, and maybe we could bring in some other people like the Reverend Vanderklay, and I'm game because, but I'm not sure that the Reverend Paul Vanderklay would be ready as yet. I mean, I keep trying to bring him along slowly, but I think sometimes he may feel a little bit challenged. And so there's a random question from one of my viewers on Periscope, and so if you will give me the random question, I'll quickly get it. Do you know if Jung wrote anything about individuals who grew up without a father? I think that's the only thing he did write about, actually, because essentially he spent his whole life talking about his father and the fact that his father had lost his faith, and his father, that was bad because his father was a reformed pastor, just like Dr. Vanderklay. And so, you know, there are a lot of things around. There was, in the 90s, there was this men's movement. And I remember in one of the audio tapes, these were audio tapes that I got through the Sounds True catalog. And these were men's movement audios that were included Robert Bly, B-L-Y, and James Hillman, among many others. But I remember one thing that they said, and that was, it's archetypal for the father not to be present. Okay, so in the sense of unfathered men, pretty much historically, all children were unfathered because father was always away fighting a war or doing something, or they were off at work. And, you know, I remember my own father, although we had a close relationship throughout his life when I've been around, but, you know, he was always gone during the day, and I was interacting with my mother, and then because he was a naval officer, he was at sea, and so he would be deployed for months at a time, and the household would only have my mother in it, and occasionally there'd be another naval officer around who would in some way interact with us. But, you know, honestly, what they were saying in the 90s, and I haven't found that really, but what they were saying in the 90s was that it's archetypal for the father to be away. And so, you know, you can't feel put upon because your father wasn't around. So this is a response to my follower here on Periscope. So anyway, if anyone has a thought about the technology that could be used to do a group online other than Google Hangouts, which I'm aware of, and as I said, that's limited to 10. So my Periscope follower said Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad were all fatherless too. Yeah, I don't, you know, honestly, in the Jesus story, I don't remember what happened to Jesus's father, to Joseph after his birth. Christ was only with God, and Mary was a virgin. Okay, so yeah, I mean, Jesus was fatherless, and he was an illegitimate child, if you will. I might, let's see, you may not, just give me a minute to get a book here. Okay, so there's an interesting anecdote in this book, Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology, by Dr. Lawrence Jaffe. I've done a number of videos on this book, but there's a very interesting anecdote which I think I can find here. So Dr. Jaffe was referring to the last time Dr. Jung was in the United States was in 1937, believe it or not. and he was giving a talk at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and he was a bit shaken because the fellow that was using the projector, this would have been a very rudimentary early AV projector that was being used, was incompetent, and so the slides kept coming up wrong, and so Dr. Jung was quite upset, and so here's what Jaffe says, and it relates to the fatherhood of Jesus. He says, following the tragicomical lecture, a gala supper party was planned to celebrate the conclusion of Jung's visit. Some of his friends prevailed upon him to say a few final words. Our witness reports that Jung's humbling experience might have influenced his remarks. If so, we owe a debt of gratitude to that inept projectionist, for a more moving statement of Jung's essential vision has not come down to us. Here, in part, is what Jung said, quote, Jesus, you know, was a boy born of an unmarried mother. Such a boy is called illegitimate, and there is a prejudice which puts him at a great disadvantage. He suffers from a terrible feeling of inferiority for which he is certain to have to compensate. Hence the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, in which the kingdom was offered to him. Here he met his worst enemy, the power devil, but he was able to see that and to refuse. He said, quote, my kingdom is not of this world, unquote. But kingdom it was all the same, and you remember that strange incident, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The utter failure came at the crucifixion in the tragic words, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? If you want to understand the full tragedy of those words, you must realize what they meant. Christ saw that his whole life, devoted to the truth according to his best conviction, had been a terrible illusion. He had lived it to the full, absolutely sincerely. He had made his honest experiment, but it was nevertheless a compensation. But because he had lived so fully and devotedly, he won through to the resurrection body. We must all do just what Jesus did. We must all do just what Christ did. We must make our experiment. We must make mistakes. We must live out our own vision of life, and there will be error. If you avoid error, you do not live. In a sense, even it may be said that every life is a mistake, for no one has found the truth. When we live like this, we know Christ as a brother, and God indeed becomes man. This sounds like a terrible blasphemy, but not so, for then only can we understand Christ as he would want to be understood, as a fellow man. Then only does God become man in ourselves. This sounds like religion, but it is not. I am speaking just as a philosopher. People sometimes call me a religious leader. I am not that. I attempt only to understand. And so the last thing I would say to each of you, my friends, is carry through your life as well as you can, even if it is based on error, because life has to be undone, and one often gets to truth through error. Then, like Christ, you will have accomplished your experiment. So be human. Seek understanding, seek insight, and make your hypothesis your philosophy of life. Then we may recognize the spirit alive in the unconscious of every individual. Then we become brothers of Christ. In the margin, I wrote, next to the following words, quote, this is the key, unquote, Christ saw that his whole life, devoted to the truth according to his best conviction, had been a terrible illusion. He had lived it to the full, absolutely sincerely. He had made his honest experiment, but it was nevertheless a compensation. Okay, so for what it's worth, I digress, but let me move on here. So we get to the divine child. The divine child will be born of the empirical man, continuing incarnation. The metaphysical process is known to the psychology of the unconscious as the individuation process. The acorn becomes an oak. Conscious must confront unconscious. Balance must be found. And so one of the key points here is that if you individuate, if you learn how to unite the opposites within yourself as opposed to blaming the government or blaming your father or blaming whoever else, but see that the opposites are within you, then you tend to individuate consciously. But if you don't do it consciously, individuation happens anyway. And so the metaphor is the acorn becomes the oak. And what Dr. Jung said earlier in these passages is, but if you individuate, you at least get to the goal walking upright rather than being dragged along. Okay, so paragraph 756, difference between natural individuation and conscious individuation is tremendous, as in uniting the opposites and so on. There's just, you can really tell who's an individuated being and who is not. Miles says, in fact, fathers around the house get criticized for being around the house and not out there hunting or at work. Absolutely. Buddha's Breath says, I just witnessed you being in the state of which you were reading. Yeah. Somewhat. Let's see. All right, so we're up to paragraph 757. And here is this, what you see in red here next to 757 is one of the key quotes of Dr. Jung, which we find very frequently on Jungian websites. He says, it is only through the psyche that we can establish that God acts upon us. But we are unable to distinguish whether these actions emanate from God or from the unconscious. We cannot tell whether God and the unconscious are two different entities. The archetype of wholeness, the self, the God image, manifests in dreams and visions, and therefore psychologists and Dr. Jung could point to it as something knowable, but also he says distinguishing between the metaphysical God and the God image doesn't help us. It only separates man from God. And so he says it's better to teach God's nearness. And only that which acts upon me do I recognize as real and actual. And so, the point is, what's the point of God being out there? Because then, I don't know. But if I recognize that God is within me, or certainly the God image is within me, then I can work with it. But I can't work with it when it's out there. So then we get to paragraph 758. And again, these are very long paragraphs. And I'm just taking the really big mountaintops here, but I'm happy to discuss after we get to the end. They're still at it. Oh, now we have the leaf blower going through. We've had the edge cutter, the lawnmower, and now we have the leaf blower. Okay. Well, we have a thoroughly worked gated community. Anyway, paragraph 750. Is that sound interfering with your being able to hear? If not, I might wait 10 minutes. Or if it is, I'll stop. Otherwise, I'm just going to go on. Okay. So paragraph 758. The indwelling of the Holy Ghost, the third divine person in man, brings about a Christification of many, and the question then arises whether these many are all complete God-men. Such a transformation would lead to insufferable collisions between them, to say nothing of the unavoidable inflation to which the ordinary mortal, who is not freed from original sin, would instantly succumb. Okay, so the point Dr. Jung was making at several points during his work was that the Holy Ghost, as Christ explained it, the Paraclete, was intended to enter into his followers. And it wasn't the imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, but actually for us to take a part of Christ within us and to experience what Christ experienced. I mean, this is the point of this story that I read. And if we do that, if we believe that that's what we're doing, or something akin to it, if you happen to be a follower of another religion, then there's this danger of becoming inflated. Certainly we know at least one person who thinks he has the answer for everything and in a great inflation. And the question is whether that's good for mental health and whether it's good for society. I guess we'll know very soon. But the the inflation is a normal thing, and so he talks in this paragraph also about St. Paul's split consciousness as the apostle and also as the sinful man. And so what Dr. Jung says is, that is to say, even the enlightened person remains what he is and is never more than his own limited ego before the one who dwells within him, whose form has no knowable boundaries, who encompasses him on all sides, fathomless as the abysms of the earth and vast as the sky. And that's how he concludes Answer to Job. So ultimately the point is that we've been through perhaps a godless period since Nietzsche proclaimed that God is dead, and maybe too many people in the 20th century believed that. And if you take only logos as your North Star, then you have to come to that conclusion, because the God that we were sold as children in the Christian church, he's not where we were told. I mean, there's no physical heaven up there. There's no physical hell as described by Dante, at least. beneath us. Certainly there's something very hot down there, and probably probably the ancients got those ideas from volcanoes around the world. So there's something very hot down there, but it's nothing like Dante described. But those things are in our psyche. And I think some of you remember the story I told about my daughter who, on her 22nd birthday, she had, let's put it this way, my daughters are all very adventuresome women, and I had taken them around the world quite a lot. They spent 5 years in Japan. One of them was born in Japan. This particular daughter had spent time in Russia, and she had run into Christian missionaries. I don't know of what flavor, but they were obviously evangelical missionaries. And so she was gone for about 1.5 years. During that time, she lived with a Muslim woman in Kazan, Tatarstan. And when she came back, it happened to be at her birthday, which is the same as George Washington's birthday. So it was February 22nd. And I probably can work out the year here, 1999, I guess. So it was 2 years after she had graduated from college. And so I even know the date that this happened. So she happened to be in Washington, and I took her out to dinner for her birthday at a very well-known Afghan restaurant in downtown Washington. And we had a lovely time. We reminisced about our time in Japan, about traveling around the world, many things that we have done together over the years. And at the end of the evening, I thought the evening had gone wonderfully. But as she parted from me at the end of the evening, she said, "Well, Dad, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I think you're going to hell." I go, "What?" Who teaches a child to say that to a parent? And immediately I fell into a hell-like state. And on my drive back from Washington to Annapolis, which is about an hour drive, I had a psychogenic vision of Mephistopheles plopping down in the seat next to me in my car. And so obviously I was very psychologically disturbed by this remark. And since we know when it was almost 19 years ago. And in that period of time now, it really pushed me into my Jungian study to understand what really was going on with all that. And I had one earlier psychogenic experience which lasted 8 months in 1993, so I knew that it was a psychogenic experience, but it was disconcerting, and I cut the Faustian bargain with my sidekick that was in the car with me, and that was that I told him that he could have my eternal soul after my death on the condition that none of my daughters would think that of me for the rest of my physical life. And he disappeared when I cut that bargain. So I don't know how it's going to come out, but anyway, I can tell you that the period after that was definitely a kind of hell for me. And okay, so now I'm gonna, let's see, let me look at what comments we have. Yes, I'm definitely surrounded by metaphors all the time. Miles says, God is dead upon a person thinking is about exceptionalism, in my opinion. This is the blessing Jung communicated. Exceptionalism is the antithesis of peace and friendship, truth and life. Well, I would say I'm equivocal about that comment, Miles. When we obviously there's a discussion about American exceptionalism, and I think it's just the semantics we're using here. But I do think that the United States is exceptional. It's not exceptional for a lot of the reasons that many Americans think it is, and to a lesser extent, Canada is, and by a lesser extent, I mean only because Canada's population is smaller, not because the phenomenon is any less. And in fact, Canada may be living the exceptionalism better than Americans, better than United States Americans are these days. So this isn't meant to be a put down toward Canada, but as I look at what happened in North America, North and South America, these were land masses that were separated from the human history all the way through until whatever date you want to pick. I think the most common date is about 13,000 years ago, but I know there's some anthropologists who think that humans in even South America went back as far as 35,000 years ago. But whichever it is, it's a blink of the eye in terms of human history. And so in that sense, I think that the landmass was held apart. And when humans started to enter into the Americas, it caused every possible human group, religion, race, creed, you name it, to come up against one another. And the result was that, there have been a lot of clashes, and still we resolve, even though we haven't had civil wars per se, since the 19th century, we certainly do have a lot of butting heads in the United States, at least, between people of different opinions. And I think that process, the possibility of that process, is a process like tempering steel. And so I feel that it made at least our country and Canada also stronger, because in both countries we generally are able to live together despite all the diversity of our populations. And you might want to argue that point based on what you see on cable news every night, but the fact is that if think about it as you travel around, if you're in the United States or Canada, think about it as you travel around, and perhaps in some of the European countries. I think there's more trouble there than here, but here we largely accept everybody today. I mean, I obviously I understand that we have our bigots, and they're not going to be around forever. And I see that the next generation doesn't even care about what they care about. It so happens that 3 of my grandchildren are Korean Americans, 3 of them are Irish Americans, and 4 of them or 2 of them are Irish Americans, and 4 of them are descended from British on their father's side, and on their mother's side, mainly German and Northern European. I consider myself mostly Dutch, but that includes Pennsylvania Deutsch, which is German. So my point is that we have clashed up against one another and found a way to live together. So if you go to the grocery store, you're not going to find people in fistfights in the grocery store today. We get along. We're not perfectly mixed in the sense of baking a cake. And you mix a batter together and can cook it into something like that. But we are very heterogeneous, and that, I don't think that's as possible in countries that have millennia long histories. If you take a country like Turkey or Egypt that have grown up, or China, Russia perhaps, that have grown up with a long history, it's not as easy to have the clashes that are necessary to wake people up. And so that's why I think we have exceptionalism in the United States. That's my American exceptionalism. Okay, so the Christians say you are going to hell outside of their belief. This is exceptionalism too. Well, they're wrong. I've been to hell, and I know I went to hell inside their belief, not outside of it. Matthew says, I would use a more narrow definition of exceptionalism. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, we can all differ on my homily about diversity in America, in the United States and Canada. And so he says, though I see what you mean. Miles says, often I am realizing I don't know English as well as I should. He says, exclusivism, perhaps. Okay, well, I've lost the thread on that discussion. So I'm going to move on. Clark Nichols says, America, this is very general, but any discussion of something so big is attempts to give individuals freedom. Very few places on earth actually attempt to do that. I think that's a fair enough comment. And it's very difficult for other places. I mean, just imagine if you're Romania or something like that, and you suddenly have a parade of Syrian refugees or Iranian refugees going across your country. I mean, obviously that's a big threat, and so it's not as easy in other places as it has been here. And so I'm not saying it's easy. I mean, the United States is a difficult place, and you have to have your guard up. But anyway, isn't exceptionalism brought up by Westerner ideology compared to Asian philosophy? Yes, I would say that's true. And we're talking about two ends of a spectrum, with the ego as one psychological center and the self as the other psychological center. And as Dr. Edinger explained it, Christ represents the ego and Buddha, the Buddha represents the self end. And I think that there needs to be a balance there too, because what I observe about Buddhists, let's say, or even Hindus, or a Hindu country, India, is that they've managed to support their populations extremely well. And so there are a lot of them, a lot of Indians and a lot of Tibetans and so on. So they survive, but they also without enough ego, they seem to me to be very passive. And I've lived in a lot of these countries over the years, and especially India and China to a degree. And I think that, they seem to me relatively passive as compared to the ego end of the spectrum. So yes, I agree with that idea. Okay, so I'm now going to go back and refer back to these, to Dr. Edinger's book here, Transformation of the God Image, which is Dr. Edinger's 10 lectures on answer to Job. Now, interestingly, in the last two segments that we've done, in the last two lectures, Dr. Edinger sort of pulled his punch, and he didn't really go into some of these political issues, although he did talk about some things. So I'm going to remind you about a few of them. So he reminds us that Dr. Jung's process is an evolutionary process of the divine drama. And so the divine drama is going on in our psyches, and it is the interrelationship of all of our archetypes. And as Dr. Jung explained and Dr. Edinger also explained, religions were what passed for psychotherapy for thousands of years before anybody figured out that there should be something called psychotherapy or psychology. And so, there's nothing particularly wrong with any religion per se. They all are right. They're all true. And that's an important thing to take out of what Dr. Jung said, which is that for the people who follow any given religion, for them, their psychic facts are true. And so for someone who's been raised as a Christian, those stories are true in some way. Whether they're true metaphorically or true physically is not the issue. But they're religious statements that are true as psychic facts. And so therefore we have to start to think about our religions as ways to learn what we have in common rather than what we have different. If we understand that most religions have parallel things in them, then we understand the need to see how the other side lives, and to see what we can take from other religions that can help us. And gradually we may start to flow together instead of trying to kill one another over a difference in belief, which is ridiculous. So in terms of the Jewish tradition, however, Yahweh needed man in order to realize himself. So he needed consciousness of his scope. And so the universal creator God is loving and wrathful, creative and destructive. And Job saw God's backside, thereby requiring God to become man. So in other words, Job saw that God wasn't only something that's out there in the heavens, but is actually within ourselves. And if you look at any cosmology, my wife and I frequently watch astronomical programs about the creation of the universe and the first stars and things like that. And if you look at any of that, you have to understand that God, as we talk about him in any religion, is a human invention, basically. It comes out of our psyches. We don't see any dogs going to the temple or whatever it is, to church. So Christ became the new image of God, the loving Father with no darkness, and his crucifixion was the punishment, in effect, for God's crime committed to Job, which was the nasty trick with Satan of making Job not give up on God. So Jung explained to Leonid Kochnig in his letter of June 30, 1956, which is in Letters, Volume 2, page 313. If you're a member of our Dropbox, you can find it. And this is Jung's quote: As a consequence, the sacrifice was a self-destruction of the amoral God, incarnated in a mortal body. Thus, the sacrifice takes on the aspect of a highly moral deed, of a self-punishment, as it were. Okay, so that's the way Dr. Jung interpreted it in 1956, so 5 years before his death. So he was near 80 when he wrote that. Satan, the evil son, was cast out of heaven, and Revelation predicts an enantiodromia, and the return of the evil son. So, and that was after 1,000 years. So at about the year 1000 or 1100, we started to see Satan manifest himself, and this was the enantiodromia that was predicted in Revelation, in John of Patmos's Revelation. And so now what Dr. Jung is saying is that the Assumption of the Virgin Mary is another enantiodromia after the second millennium, which is now we're going back to this longing for peace. Okay, this important quote that's in, I think it's 754. Let's see. Yeah, he says, referring to Mary and her elevated position, at any rate, her position satisfies the need of the archetype. The new dogma expresses a renewed hope for the fulfillment of that yearning for peace which stirs deep down in the soul, and for a resolution of the threatening tension between the opposites. Well, I think all Americans today can certainly relate to the threatening tension between the opposites, regardless of what your political position is. And obviously at the time he was writing this, 1952, just 7 years after World War II, and after he had also gone through World War I and actually served in the Swiss military during World War I. He was a prisoner of war camp commander during that period. Obviously, there was a tremendous yearning for peace then. As a retired military person, I can tell you that I certainly yearn for peace, and I hope that our leaders have enough wisdom to keep that going. And whether they will or not is a constant question, because our president announced today that there's going to be no summit about North Korea, so at least not on June 12th as previously thought. And so we have this duality in our lives just today. Okay, so Clark says, I think one of the main problems with American world is progress and an assumption that there is something we can do to end suffering, or that the cessation of sin would somehow be preferable. Well, I think it's probably the cessation of sin is probably impossible, and obviously the idea of progress in the context of what happened in the 19th and 20th century with the Industrial Revolution is a big problem, because if every human being in the world were to try to live the way Americans do, it would not be possible, and so there are going to be serious dislocations in the way people live around the world. It's not going to affect North America, maybe. Short of thermonuclear war, it probably won't affect us as much as it will affect Northern Europe, but it's definitely an issue. Clark says it is the other side of the coin of this long-term meme that the world is just getting better. People experience this and internalized it so profoundly they believe they can create utopia. This is a shadow people who are ignoring and a flaw in the logic of our modern myth. Well, that's certainly true. I mean, my wife, who I jokingly refer to as the weather girl, because she's always telling me what the weather is, and she'll spend a half an hour a day staring at the Weather Channel if I let her. She keeps telling me that there are signs that the Gulf Stream may stop circulating because of changes in global weather. And if that were to happen, there would be tremendous impact on Northern Europe, because I don't know if any of you have ever looked at a globe, but if you look at the globe and the latitudes of Northern Europe, you find that much of Northern Europe is way up north, and it could get quite a bit colder if there's no Gulf Stream to warm it up. And I remember when I was living in Alaska in Kodiak as a boy, we had 140 inches of rain there, believe it or not that much snow, because Kodiak is in the Japanese current that comes around across Japan and then back down across Washington, Oregon, and California, Canada. And so Kodiak was quite a bit warmed by that current, and if that current were to stop flowing, it would have a significant impact on the weather there. And so we do have a reality check. Now, how fast can these things happen? I don't know. I mean, can we live our lives, and can our children and grandchildren live our lives? Even if it starts to happen, is it going to happen slowly enough so it's like a car wreck in slow motion? Yeah, maybe. I happen to live in Annapolis, Maryland, which is very near to sea level, and so we have had a Hurricane Isabel in 2003 that filled the downtown part of Annapolis up, and it flooded major portions of the U.S. Naval Academy. There was more than $200 million damage done to the U.S. Naval Academy at that time, and like half of the Naval Academy is on a landfill, so that gives you a sense of it. And so if even a small change happens, there's going to be a big issue in my town. So Clark says, So Clark says, but civilization's use. Okay, so Clark's referring to his statement about the idea of creating utopia, and he says that this is a shadow people are ignoring and a flaw in the logic of our modern myth. But civilizations used to fail. Your myth became a legend, and a new idea formed from that apocalypse. We now live in this unnatural frame where no idea dies in any meaningful way. How else can one live without a dread of or anxiety becoming a constant low volume hum in their thinking? Well, I think that we do have collapses, and certainly the financial crash of 2004 was an apocalypse for me. I had a very successful business career, but 2008 was, I was already near the end of my business career. So when I lost my life savings at that time, it crushed me, and I had to revivify. And one of my neighbors didn't. He committed suicide, and he had a successful business too, and life can go on. One of the things that I talk about is that in our mind we have negative things. I was listening to Anne Ulanoff, who's a professor at Union Theological Seminary, and she's a professor of psychiatry and religion, believe it or not, but she's a Jungian analyst, a very famous Jungian analyst. Her name is Ulanoff, U-L-A-N-O-V. She's written quite a number of books, but let's see, and I forgot what my point was about her comments, so I guess my age is starting to show. Anyway, I urge you all to look up Anne Ulanoff. And somebody on Periscope who can see my knee scooter is asking what the wheelie thing is, and that's my knee scooter because on Valentine's Day I had my ankle replaced, and so that was my mode of transportation for 6 weeks. But I'm glad to report that we have joint replacement well and truly under control in the United States. I can't speak for other countries, but in the last year I've had both my left knee and my right ankle replaced, and except for the time of recovery, I'm pretty much totally recovered and back to normal, and my ankle is better than it's been in 30 years. Breaking it was the last thing I did in uniform. So anyway, we need to, anyway, I think we've probably done the best we can do on Answer to Job. I can't do any better than what I've done. One of the things that Anne Ulanoff talked about was how do we create soul? And her suggestion was to take something, anything, and then put your own ideas on it. And whether it's a novel or a poem or whatever. And obviously I feel that my work on this Jungian channel is very soulful for me, and it seems to be serving a need for quite a number of the subscribers to this channel. I'm normally getting 35 to 45 people watching on YouTube when I'm doing a live session, and on Periscope, I just started to turn it on about 5 or 6 weeks ago on a regular basis, and I typically get maybe 20 or 30 people that log on to it during the session, and over 100 that watch some or all of the video, and a lot of people watch 100% of these videos. So they obviously fulfill a need in the society. For me, they definitely do. They're very soulful. And so I urge you to think about her dictum on that, which is to take something that is meaningful to you and put your own twist on it. Obviously, many of you have followed this through now 13 sessions for Answer to Job, so you've heard my twist on Answer to Job, but you might want to either do the same thing yourself or read something of Jung's and write a poem about it or something like that. Those sorts of things are very soulful and can be helpful. Clark says, this work on Answer to Job has been phenomenal and important to me. Thanks so much for what you've done here. I appreciate that, Clark, very much, because accolades are few and far between. What I would urge all of you to do is, especially when this session comes online as a replay, which will happen in the next hour or so, I'd be very appreciative if you'd hit the share button and share it on your social networks. That helps build up the subscribership. The other day, one gentleman had asked for permission to do that, and of course I gave it, and he did a very nice post on Reddit, and overnight I got 86 new followers, which was quite surprising. I'd been averaging maybe 6 or 8 new followers a day, let's say. And then all of a sudden, last week I had one day that there were 86 new followers. And I said, wow, how did that happen? And then he admitted that he had put this link on Reddit. And so I said, so you're the one. Anyway, are there any thoughts about what to do next? I'm game. I have started to put Ion on as a reading, but I'm sort of reluctant to do those readings at the moment. But I have gotten well and truly into Ion, which is researches into the phenomenology of the self. Ion is a much longer and more complex book than Answer to Job, even if you believe that. It is 429 paragraphs, whereas Answer to Job was 205 paragraphs. And there is Ion lectures, as you would know if you followed my readings. Edward Edinger did a series of lectures on Ion, and so far I got about halfway through Ion, reading it side by side with Edinger, and so I could start to do a series of lectures on Ion that would probably push me through in terms of finishing it myself. I have read it a couple of times, but one of the reasons I like to do this is in order to anchor it in my own mind. And I just let me show you one thing here. This is a diagram that Dr. Edinger created of the psyche. And so at the top of this diagram, there are 3 egos. One's a woman's ego, a man's ego, and in the center, it's a neutral ego of some sort. I can't really read it, unfortunately. And so then it shows the shadow coming down from the central ego, but there would be one from each of the egos. And these go through what's called the C.G, which is, so the shadow is an archetype, the ego is an archetype. And so this book, Ion, begins with chapter 1 is the ego, chapter 2 is the shadow, then chapter 3 is called the C.G, which is the anima and the animus, and then chapter 4 is the self, and it's based on this diagram which Dr. Edward Edinger prepared in his Ion lectures. And it's an image that I often show to help people understand what we're talking about. So the self is unconscious, so is the anima and the animus. And the ego is the only thing that's really conscious in terms of our psyche. But I could start to do something on those. Just see what anybody has said here. So Word Made Flesh says, your work's been great help to me. Thank you. I'm glad it has helped you, and it always helps me as well. So it's definitely been worth doing. And someone on Periscope says, sounds complex, the ego. And it definitely is complex. Our psyches are incredibly complex. Each one of our psyches is a universe unto itself. And it's interesting, one of the comments that Dr. Jung made late in life is that if everything were to be destroyed, and I presume he meant something as catastrophic as the earth itself being destroyed, he says it would all begin again. And because this is what, as Carl Sagan said, this is some of the things that hydrogen atoms do given 13.7 billion years to develop. So Sage Master 4 says his understanding of the self seems to be based on Heidegger. Yes, I think that Jung did take from Heidegger, but as Dr. Edinger said, Jungian analysts or Jungians are basically Kantians. So I'm not really up to snuff on the earlier philosophers like Heidegger and Kant, so I can't really speak to it. My purpose in doing these videos for the last 2 years, next week it'll be 2 years, I'll begin the 3rd year of this group, and my purpose has always been simply to help people understand what I understand about what Dr. Jung was trying to say. I'm not saying he was right. I do not know if he is right. And each one of us has to find our own truth. But I do know that I have found what I consider to be God thanks to Dr. Jung's work. And that was with a couple of epiphanies. One is the epiphany that's carried in paragraphs 751 and 752 of Answer to Job, which we've talked about today, and which, I was always mystified by what religion people were saying versus what I saw outside my house and my car. And so, what are they talking about? And I became a deacon in the Reformed Church, I remember, and at one point I asked the pastor, what's your image of what God is? And his answer was unmemorable entirely. And but actually the first epiphany I had was when I watched Dr. Jung on his BBC interview, and he was asked whether he believed in God, and he said, "I have no need to believe, I know." And at that moment, I said, aha, because I do know there's something. I don't know what it is, but yes, I know. And if you allow yourself, you'll find that too, as we've discussed, whether that's the God image or the metaphysical God is not the issue, but something is pushing us forward. And Dr. Jung was always saying, we have to stop looking back at the Pentecost and start looking forward. Where is the Spirit trying to take us? Because over all these eons of life that have led to us, it was always just devouring and begetting, and finally human beings evolved, and now we have consciousness, which we can't attribute to any other species per se. I mean, there's creatures that have instinct and have senses, but we can't say that they have consciousness in the sense that we have consciousness. And so the question is, if the archetype is pressing through to some objective, what is that objective? Where are we going? Not where were we 2,000 years ago, but where are we going? That's the big question. So Clark says, Clark is interested in volumes 12 and 13. I forget what 12 is, but 13 is psychological studies, I think, which I am working on. And so it's alchemical studies. It's this book right here. And actually, I am going to be doing sessions on alchemical studies beginning on June 4th in the group meeting. And please note, if you have been following the group meetings on Monday nights, that we will not be having such a meeting on Memorial Day. So volume 13 is alchemical studies, and let me go. Okay, volume 12 is psychology and alchemy. Well, what I'm going to do, Clark, is, and these meetings are held every Monday night at 8 p.m. except when it's a national holiday. And so what I am going to do in the next 3 or 4 is talk about The Secret of the Golden Flower, which is the first essay in Alchemical Studies, volume 13. If you're a member of our Dropbox, you can find it there. If you're not a member, you can send your email address to skip.conover@gmail.com. I need your regular email address, and then I can put you into the Dropbox, and you can have access to some of the things that we have. There's a lot of stuff in there, but exactly what I am reticent about normally. But if you wish to join our Dropbox, send an email to skip.conover@gmail.com and I will add you. The reason I want to start with Secret of the Golden Flower is because that was the transitional activity that Dr. Jung took on in 1928 when Richard Wilhelm came back from China and asked him to write the commentary, the psychological commentary on it. And what I'm going to do, my wife was rather critical of the idea that I would do a meeting next Monday, and as I thought about it, I found it was I thought it was not proper either, because on Memorial Day I do remember my roommate from the basic school in the U.S. Marines. We were second lieutenants together, and 5 months after we graduated, he was killed in action in Vietnam on April 11th, 1969. His name was Robert M. Christian, believe it or not, Jr. Anyway, some of you probably know that already, but anyway, so I'm not going to do a session next Monday, but what I thought I would do is do an unscheduled behind the scenes session sometime between now and June 4th, in which I will discuss the context of why Dr. Jung took up The Secret of the Golden Flower, which is partially covered in the early part of Secret of the Golden Flower, but is also covered in Dr. Jung's eulogy of Richard Wilhelm, which is quite long. He must have spoken for about an hour. And he explains why that intersection between him and Dr. Wilhelm was such an important aspect of his own career and development, and why he went into alchemy at such great length. And for those of you who don't know and still think that alchemy was about making gold, please disabuse yourselves of those ideas, because alchemy was about chemistry to a certain extent, but it was very definitely about psychology. And Dr. Jung was the man that unearthed that fact and then started to talk about what the alchemists were really talking about, which was psychological gold. And they worked at it for 1700 years, so it's quite an important area. So that too is interesting, Clark. We'll start to work on that, and I'm thinking of doing the alchemical work in the Monday night reading group. And so for this Thursday time frame, 1:30, maybe we'll do something else. If you have suggestions on that, let me know. I might consider doing it with Eon if I don't hear, or Ion, Aeon. I think I finally settled on Ion as the way to pronounce it. But anyway, I probably will start with that maybe next week. And Edinger's Apocalypse, that's good, but I think we've already covered the apocalypse, at least in Answer to Job, and it was covered by Edinger in his book here that went along with Answer to Job. And so I think that would be a bit repetitious. The other book that might be useful, though, is Ego and Archetype, which is Edinger's book. And so let me think about that in the next week and surprise you next week in terms of what to do. But it's interesting to hear your interest in alchemy. So at least you know something about what's going on here. Okay, so I am going to, not hearing from others except for Clark, in terms of what to work on next. I'm going to go ahead and terminate this session because I only have 1 minute before the end of our 2-hour time frame. And so Clark says, Ian, on Thursday could be really good ideas, simply a deep good for new subscribers. Edinger, though, might lead newer people into a great Jung transliterator. I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean by that, Clark, but you can always send me an email and we can talk about that. Obviously, I did a lot of my early study, which has now gone on 31 years, but a lot of my early study was people talking about Jung. And I didn't start to read my direct Jung for many years because I thought it was mainly about the details of psychoanalysis, in which I was not interested. And it was only in 2005 that Louis LaFontaine got me thinking about the fact that I ought to be reading Dr. Jung's work directly. I had read Man and His Symbols and Memory Streams Reflections before that, but I think that his direct work is it's very difficult to follow, okay? And especially it's difficult to follow without the help of Dr. Edinger, but it's also very important. So yes, Golden Flower is big stuff. I reread it the other day in preparation for thinking about this, and it really covers a vast area of Dr. Jung's oeuvre, so it's important for that reason. So anyway, okay, I'm going to terminate now because otherwise we're going to lose the beginning of this video. So thank you all for joining, and I will see you soon, at least next Thursday. Not next Monday, though. Monday is going to be Memorial Day. And as I said, I probably will do an unscheduled session at some point here. So thank you for joining. I'll see you soon. And I am turning